This is God's Quality Control 14.2.2. Here I continue my review of the 6.5-hour miniseries Jesus of Nazareth, with the purpose of exploring the reasons people tend to think of Jesus as some great guy full of timeless wisdom, despite the Bible clearly depicting him as a dim-witted, short-sighted nincompoop. Out in the Jordan River, we find John the Baptist still preaching and baptizing as he was in the previous episode, but then here comes Jesus to be baptized. Hilariously, the adult Jesus looks a lot like Tim Minchin, modern comedian and singer-songwriter of such amazing works as Thank You God, which you really must listen to if you haven't already. Strangely, Jesus no longer has blonde hair or blue eyes. One must wonder what the creators of this movie are trying to say, casting not one but two different Scandinavian-looking children as Jesus, and then this guy. It's not like they couldn't have found different children. Neither one did anything like acting. But I have no literary skill. I have no idea what message most authors are attempting to impart, and this casting choice is no exception. After Jesus is baptized, he walks away in the weird fashion you see among the nobility in shows like Game of Thrones. They don't swing their arms when they walk like normal people. They keep their arms still down by their side. It's weird, and I don't get it. The Bible doesn't say Jesus walked like that. It also doesn't say that he stared through people when he talked, like he's not really looking in their eyes, but at something in the distance behind them. However, given all the downright weird things Jesus says in the Gospels, perhaps it makes sense that he would walk and talk and stare weirdly. At the synagogue in Nazareth, it's some random dude's turn to read from the Torah, but Jesus rudely cuts in front of him and begins reading the famous verse from the prophet Isaiah, "God has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor." Surprisingly, this rudeness is added by the movie. In the Bible, Jesus doesn't cut in front of anyone to read the scriptures. However, the rest of the scene is straight from the Bible. That is, when the men of the synagogue demand that Jesus explain himself, he answers with nonsense, and complains that his own countrymen are rejecting him. Later, at the synagogue in Capernaum, Jesus is lecturing his fellow Jews about the law, specifically about allowing it to grow and change. This is 100% manufactured. The man in the Gospels was emphatic about the unchanging nature of the law, even making it one of the main points in the Sermon on the Mount, right after he announced that it's a virtue to be persecuted, thus making Christianity a magnet for everyone with a persecution complex. While Jesus is still lecturing, a demon-possessed man runs into the synagogue, screaming and foaming at the mouth. Jesus casts out the demon, and the man is restored to normalcy. It's interesting to note that hundreds of years before Jesus, Greek and Roman physicians had already been dismissing the notion of demon possession, suggesting that what we now call mental illness is indeed mental illness, unrelated to the supernatural, and even suggesting that those who claimed to cast out demons were charlatans and quacks. Later, we meet the Apostle John, the disciple whom Jesus loved. In the movie, he's a scholar and a philosopher, having been sent off to school by his family. We also meet Simon Peter, who, although not educated, is very intelligent, thoughtful, well-spoken, and opinionated. These two characters are very much inventions of the movie. In the Gospels, John is practically invisible, while Peter is made out to be a bumbler and a loudmouth, and the object of mountains of scorn from Jesus. But this Peter, at least at first, is the one full of scorn, telling Jesus that people need to be fed rather than given empty, spiritual-sounding platitudes. Sadly, it doesn't take long for Peter to forget the wife and children he passionately and repeatedly defends and abandon them due to the influence and express encouragement of Jesus. At Simon Peter's house, which is enormous, with a huge walled courtyard big enough for 100 people to crowd into, which is totally not in the Bible, a bunch of villagers tear a completely unnecessary hole in the thatched roof in order to lower a crippled man, tied to a rudimentary stretcher, down to Jesus. Jesus tells the man that his sins are forgiven. The onlookers crammed into Peter's huge courtyard object, saying that only God can forgive sins. In order to prove that he has the authority and the power to forgive sins, Jesus also heals the crippled man, telling him to rise and walk home. Not out of compassion for the man's suffering, but to demonstrate his power and authority. Jesus invites himself to dine at the home of Matthew, the tax collector. This is true to the Gospels, as Jesus does indeed invite himself into rich people's homes occasionally, and the biblical Matthew is indeed rich. One of the first things he does is to throw a huge party in Jesus' honor. Jesus tells the story of the prodigal son who demands his share of his father's estate, runs off to squander it, finds himself in ruinous circumstances, comes back to beg his father's forgiveness, and is received with open arms. These are the points of the story that people seem to notice, the points that make it a beloved story of forgiveness and celebration of prodigals coming to their senses. But there's a lot more to it that people don't seem to notice. For starters, the father in the story is very wealthy. This is a theme for Jesus, as we'll see. The man has an estate that he can divide among his sons and still have fields and hired servants left over. When the son returns, there's fine clothing and even jewelry to spare for him, and surplus livestock on hand that can be slaughtered for a party. The father calls for celebration, music, dancing, but fails to invite his older son, who is still out working in the fields and learns of his brother's return only when he hears the party going on. As it turns out, the older brother has always been obedient, but the father has never shown him even the slightest appreciation. When the older brother complains about this treatment, the father doesn't even hint at an apology or remorse or sympathy of any kind, but emphasizes the importance of the younger brother's return. In other words, and this is also a theme for Jesus, screw your feelings. This is the story of a rich man who neglects the emotional needs of one child while fawning over the other. It's not a happy story. It's not full of timeless wisdom. It's a clear indication that Jesus just didn't get human nature. He didn't understand or care about how much even a materially comfortable life can hurt, especially how much we parents can hurt our children, or what kind of things we could do to not hurt them so much, or to help heal the wounds we cause them. Quite surprisingly, the movie does a great job of underscoring Peter's abandonment of his wife and children, about whom he seemed deeply concerned when he first met Jesus. Just after a scene where Peter silently struggles over his decision and finally sends home his fishing boat and his assistants, some of whom could even be his children, although it's not made clear, Jesus tells everyone that he has come to sow discord among families, and promises them that anyone who abandons their own family for him will be unimaginably rewarded in heaven. Jesus really is on record saying these things in Luke chapter 12. Later, Jesus resurrects a little girl who has died, the daughter of a guy called Jairus, one of the synagogue leaders. But is it due to his great compassion that he resurrects the girl? Obviously not. How many little girls died every day during his ministry all over Judea of all kinds of horrible causes? Or, closer to home, what about all the infant boys killed by Herod's soldiers while Jesus was spirited away and God stood by doing nothing? And what about all the infants killed by the armies of Moses and Joshua on God's direct orders? It isn't for compassion that Jesus resurrects the girl. As ever, it's to demonstrate his power. The second episode ends with a scene in which Judas, not the cardboard villain depicted in the Gospels, but a sincere seeker who genuinely wishes to assist Jesus in his mission, practically begs to be accepted as a disciple. Jesus responds with cryptic comments that carry more than a hint of judgment and accusation, and despite all his pretense to omniscience, nevertheless must ask Judas his name. That is, although the Judas character is fictionalized, the Jesus character acts just like the guy in the Gospels. That's 14.2.2. Thanks for watching.